I now welcome our first witness, SELMA BUREK-CELEJEWSKA.
Celejewska.
Okay. Could you please give your name and position title and swear either an oath or an affirmation?
Okay, so SELMA BUREK-CELEJEWSKA. Position, title, I'm not entirely sure what that refers to.
Okay, just as a private citizen, that's
Private
fine.
citizen,
Okay.
yes.
And would you like to take an oath or an affirmation?
An affirmation, please.
Okay. Do you have the wording for that in front of you?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
I solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. And would you like to make an opening statement?
Yes, please. I will be brief. So I worked at the RSPCA for 8 years, 3 years as an animal attendant, and then almost 5 years as a nurse. I still feel connected to the RSPCA. I take all of my animals to the RSPCA hospital for treatment. I trust the staff. I trust the standard of care. And I prefer that my vet bills contribute to the funding of the hospital. I think the hospital is crucial to the work of the RSPCA. I still foster animals or organise foster carers, which is basically taking care of an animal that is not ready to go up for adoption yet. It might be due to age, it could be due to illness. And I commend the staff, in particular the animal attendants, the front counter staff, the veterinary nurses, the vets. They really are on the front line and carry out a very difficult job, as do the inspectors. And I wholeheartedly support the work that they do, but the issue, as I understand it, is with the appropriateness of charitable organisations enforcing the law, in particular criminal law, and there are issues in terms of resources, expertise, and funding. And I understand that this inquiry is also about looking into more suitable alternatives in the form of possibly an independent government body or a police task force. Particularly with the police task forces, this has proved successful in other jurisdictions. So I would certainly support that, but I feel there are other organisations that are better placed to advise more in depth on this area. And I'll just also touch on the issue of euthanasia. It's just a very, very vast issue that obviously impacts the animals as well as the employees. And if charitable organisations no longer had to fund an inspectorate, it would certainly mitigate some of these problems by reducing the number of animals put to sleep, by having some of that money go towards education programs and finding ways to investigating where changes can be made and finding ways to reduce the amount of animals that are euthanized. And then there's the flow-on effects of improving. This would improve also the mental health of staff, which again in turn aids the animals. I think essentially why we're here is to improve animal welfare, and I think there is common ground within all the different organisations, is that fundamentally that is what we want, although we have differing viewpoints as to how that should be achieved. And lastly, thank you for allowing me to make submissions, and thank you for asking me to provide testimony, and I hope I can play a small part in this important inquiry.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Mr. Veach has the first question.
Thank you very much for your submission and your considered contribution as an opening statement. I want to go to animals in research. you touch on that in your submission, and it's an area that we actually really haven't explored a great deal yesterday or today at this inquiry. Part of the discussion has been around the animal welfare legislation, the legislative framework, and whether or not there needs to be I guess a contemporising, a review of all that legislation, and particularly POCTA. But could I just get your views around, one, do you support the need for a complete rewrite of the animal welfare legislative framework in New South Wales? And two, how that applies to animals specifically in research?
So I don't know if I'd be able to say I support a complete a rewrite, definitely a review. And sorry, what was the second part of the...
So, and as it relates to animals in research, like what are your concerns about the current arrangements for looking after the welfare of animals who are being utilised for research?
I think not having regular inspections, and then that also connects to funding, because obviously RSPCA officers, Animal Welfare League officers, there's just not enough resources for them to be inspecting all these facilities, animals in research included. So regular or unannounced audits don't appear to be carried out, and it largely falls to employees or ethics committee to detect and report those breaches. So I think one of the fundamental things would be to have regular unannounced audits by officers who aren't actually, as opposed to a self-regulation, so having an independent person or an authorised officer performing these regular and unannounced inspections. I think that would be that would certainly be a start.
Okay, thank you.
You're also a law student, I understand.
Yes.
Can you, from the perspective of a law student, can you give us your thoughts about some of the key problems that you see in having a private charity enforcing criminal law?
Can I answer that in short, and then potentially also take it on note, because it's just so vast. I'd love to go back to it.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
I think the main issues would be, the three key issues would be resources, expertise, and accountability. So charitable organisations are already struggling, and there just isn't sufficient resources, I don't think, to adequately enforce anti-cruelty legislation. There's issues with transparency.
Sorry, could I just come in there and ask a question? What do you mean by struggling?
Well, in my experience, there was always an issue with being understaffed, due to the volumes of animals that come in and the unpredictability as well, particularly working in the hospital. So even if you technically had the right amount of staff, due to that unpredictability element, people would still be struggling to get through the work. And if there was a little bit more funding for more staff, I think that would go a long way in improving things. In terms of expertise, I refer to the inquiry that was done in Victoria, where they found a lot of issues with things like the technical aspects, like drafting briefs, which are very, very important. And again, a lot of that has to do with not having sufficient staff numbers, not having adequate training, and just a huge caseload. Again, that is connected to resources.
And you think, and you think that a lot of that is because we heard quite a bit of evidence yesterday that the funding that was being received from government was very, very small.
Minimal, yes.
Yeah, and you think that that's what is one of the biggest issues?
I think that is an aspect. Transparency, having access to more detailed information as to why certain cases aren't prosecuted, and more detailed information in terms of why animals are being euthanized.
So just to that, you did mention that if there was more resourcing, that less animals would be killed. Can you just sort of elaborate on that a
So
little?
there's always, you're working under a budget, so a lot of animals will require routine surgeries in addition to sterilizations, but there has to be room, there has to be money in the budget, and it gets to a point where there just isn't any more money to for them to undergo the surgery, in which case they might be put to sleep. There's also an issue with space, which I believe will be improved with the new shelter. But in cases when when it's peak times, as an example, something that could be done is to have like one of those porta cabins. But again, you need to have the resources to be able to.
Sorry, what's that? A porta cabin?
Porta cabin, I'm probably using the wrong term. Those temporary housings that you see on construction sites. So if you need extra space, that's potentially something you could do. But again, you do need to have the funding to carry that out. It's just one example of many.
How much effort, from your experiences, how much effort was made to keep animals with owners in situations where owners could be educated to take better care rather than it being a serious case of cruelty?
I found that it was generally, if the owner was compliant, then there would be no prosecution, unless it was an extreme case. But generally, if a member of the public was issued with an order to seek veterinary care, and with subsequent follow-up, if it was found that they had complied, or if they surrendered the animal, then a prosecution would be unlikely.
And were there resources diverted towards education of those individuals in a more, I guess what I'm asking, it seems from a lot of the evidence that there's a huge amount of discretion given to the RSPCA as to how they approach individual cases and whether they take on particular cases. In your experience working there, was there a set amount of income or resources that were put towards that sort of education role instead of seizing animals and prosecuting? How were those decisions made?
Well, there was definitely an education department. I can't say for certain whether there was money directed towards educating people that would be like individually, or where it was possible that through education prosecution could be avoided. I'm not entirely sure if funds were directed towards that, but overall it was about educating people to take better care of their animals and to keep animals with their owners, to prevent them coming into the shelter, not just in terms of cruelty, but in terms of desexing and assisting with other things like veterinary bills, or reduced. They had programs for people that were struggling financially who could get their animals sterilised or vaccinated for a lesser fee.
And how were decisions made, if you know, but by inspectors on the ground working out who they were going to charge? Are there guidelines? Was there perhaps a meeting of inspectors where they discussed their approach?
I'm not sure. We weren't privy privy to that, and I think a lot of that had to do with confidentiality. But I did hear it say often that due to things like lack of resources, cases will only be prosecuted where there is certainty of success. So that was a main aspect.
Just going back to the funding, you quote in there that the RSPCA has an operating cost or budget of around $50 million. And when you look at what they spend on the inspectorate, being $6 million and about three and a bit million of that is on wages, I think we can all agree that the government isn't necessarily giving them enough to cover that $6 million. But I struggle to reconcile how they can claim to be on Struggle Street when they've got an operating cost of $50 million and getting donations of $32.1 million. I think it speaks to some greater governance issues in how they manage their finances, potentially across the board. So I guess my question to you is, did you ever feel concerned about how money was being spent? Not necessarily across the inspectorate, but just in general.
Again, I'll answer that in brief, and if I could also take that on notice, please. I definitely did have some concerns, and actually when I started as a nurse, I had been told that a few staff members, non-inspectorate staff members, had company cars, and I believe I was also told that they were not having to pay for petrol. They have since, those particular staff members, I was then told, well, one no longer works there, but that they no longer have those vehicles. But I also heard from colleagues about how at one point there seemed to be a lot of money going into what you would more likely see in a corporate environment in terms of management. That was of concern. I can't really speak to this. I was hearing things from colleagues. I can't really speak to the details of that. Again, we weren't privy, but I can certainly speak to more colleagues, have a bit more of a think, and provide more information on that question.
And just
sorry.
Oh, just one more. And just one of your statements that you made in your submission, you state that there's a conflict of interest with RSPCA working to reform laws at the same time that they're enforcing them. And you say that it becomes a conflict when they play a major role in both of those. Can you define what you mean by a major role in reforming the law? Where do you think they have overstepped in playing that role?
I think it is an important. I think it's probably the balance. I think reforming is a very important law reform is an important aspect of what the RSPCA do. I think it becomes an issue when they're also endorsing. It's Animals Australia, but I think not Animals Australia, RSPCA Australia, which I do understand is a separate legal entity. But I think the public sees the RSPCA as a whole, and it can create perception of bias if they see the RSPCA in a law reform role, then endorsing certain brands, and then also if there are cruelty complaints, it is primarily RSPCA officers who are then investigating those, the very places that they're endorsing. So that's what I meant by that.
Okay.
So you're talking about the RSPCA stamp of approval on food products?
But you don't think that they're able to adequately distance themselves from their different operations or different things that they have going on in terms of the RSPCA tick of approval, the enforcement, and then the national body doing, I guess, law reform? I
think so. And again, from just the perspective of the public, I would imagine it creates a perception of bias and distrust. So I think the law reform part, I think combined with the RSPCA tick of approval, I think you can balance that. But if on top of that you have the enforcement, I think that's where it starts to become questionable.
And are you concerned, because there was concern yesterday that somebody mentioned that somebody gave evidence that they thought that if something was an RSPCA approved farm, that it would be hard for the RSPCA to prosecute that farm if there was a complaint of cruelty. Is that kind of what you're leaning towards?
Yes, again, people would be questioning if you're endorsing a particular brand and you're getting a certain amount of money from that, would it not be difficult at the very least to carry out a prosecution?
Mr. Secord.
Much of my questions have actually been covered by the other participating members.
So.
But I'd like to take you back to some of your comments about inappropriate for charities to enforce criminal law. So is that a philosophical view that you have, or is that a conclusion that you reached when you worked at the RSPCA?
Again, I'll answer that in brief, and then we'd like to take that on notice so I can develop it more. When I was working at the RSPCA, it was more once I started studying law and learned more about the law and what the government does, and I began to realise that it is quite an anomaly that charitable organisations are enforcing the law, particularly criminal law. That does tend to be the role of the government, and I can't think of any other charitable organisations that are tasked with something like that.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Farraway.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Wanted to ask you about the Animal Welfare Advisory Council. Obviously, we heard yesterday from DPI that it's been in place. They're looking to restructure it. And there's a process open now for applications. But I wanted to ask you the question around how do you see it functioning? What do you believe, or how do you believe that council could function better in the system generally under the current structure, or under any proposed different structure into the future?
Again, I will answer that in short, but would like to take it on notice because I think it's a big question. But again, one of the main elements would be for it to be independent, independent, and for it to be an independent government body, which is more transparent than what we have currently.
Another question, because we're running out of time. Very quickly, do you believe that the Act and the enforcement should continue to be outcomes focused for the animal as a priority over, obviously, criminal proceedings? So whatever reform, because we've heard that there will be reform to the Act, and as we've heard from other speakers, that it's a 40-plus-year-old Act. But do you believe it should continue to be an outcomes-focused decision at the end, rather than just essentially criminal proceedings and penalties issued?
So by outcome focus, do you mean
For the animal.
For the animal. I would say no. I mean, ultimately, what you want is to prevent cruelty. So you want to be able to reach animals and reach people as well before cruelty actually occurs. But that's obviously an educational aspect. But things like regular inspections play a big role. Play a big role in that.
Would you consider killing an animal that could live with some veterinary assistance or more time to find a home cruel?
I would, and unfortunately that does occur. I mean, I have been present at countless euthanasias.
Of animals that could have lived if given various opportunities,
The
medical or otherwise?
Yes, yeah. The primary reason being space and foster carers. So if an animal requires surgery, there needs to be money in the budget for the surgery. There needs to be availability of say, for the surgery to actually take place, recovery, so that might mean recovery in the actual shelter or a foster carer.
And so is there evidence that what you observed, but that it's seen when you're working at Rutherford and other places, that it appeared that the inspectorate aspect of the RSPCA was actually a burden, cumbersome, and prevented the capacity for the RSPCA to be able to provide the highest standards in caring for their animals and being a shelter and education programs. You in your evidence, you said that if the inspectorate was not sitting with the RSPCA, they would be able to perform those duties at a higher standard, the other duties?
That's certainly that would be the case, because the funding that goes towards the inspector would then be going back towards the shelter, so you could expand on so many areas, which would be education would be a major one, expanding the foster care network, having more staff in place.
Okay, thank you. Now, there's just one more question, then we're going to have to
Just
wind
super
up.
quick.
That's fine.
You touch in your submission on a really important issue, which I didn't see in many of the others, which is in relation to the mental health burden on individuals involved in animal cruelty enforcement and looking after animals. And you note the high turnover of RSPCA investigators. In your view, what could we change to make that burden less, or to ease that burden in some way? What structural change could we consider?
I think a big part of it would be to increase staff. So caseload was a major aspect, feeling that you just simply could not get to all the animals that needed help, not being able to prosecute all the cases that warranted prosecution because of time limits and limits in terms of other resources. So certainly having more staff would go a long way to lessening the caseload per person. I mean, it was really, the mental health aspect is a big part of why people leave. There's generally a very high turnover in my experience within the organisation, and I again had colleagues also agree with that. I stopped working at the RSPCA 2 years ago, and in that time I think there are only a couple of staff members left in the hospital that I worked with. Everyone else is new. And I remember having a conversation with an inspector who was a team leader at the time, and he was talking about the difficulties of trying to run the inspectorate when so many inspectors were actually on leave due to mental health.
Okay, that's very helpful. Your evidence has been very helpful, thank you. We're going to have to wind it up there.
Okay.
Appreciate that.
There's a couple of
Yes,
questions
there are
on
three
notice.
questions on notice, or four, I think. 4 questions on notice. If you could provide your more detailed answer that you are asked to within 21 days, that would be greatly appreciated.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.